Here's a solid reason to question the Quran as the Word of God. The Quran claims that Jesus' disciples were Muslims. Check out Surah 352. But when Jesus felt persistence and disbelief from them, he said, "Who are my supporters for the cause of Allah?" The disciples said, "We are supporters for Allah. We have believed in Allah and testify that we are Muslims, submitting to Him." So, according to the Quran, Jesus' apostles were Muslims. But what if we found out that their teachings were totally different from Muhammad and the Quran's? Here's an argument. Premise 1, if Jesus' original disciples rejected core Islamic teachings, then Islam doesn't hold up. Premise 2, the original disciples of Jesus did reject key Islamic teachings. Therefore, Islam doesn't hold up. Now, to get around this, a Muslim would have to reject one of these two premises. But how could they do that? Well, they might claim that the disciples were fooled, they made mistakes, or twisted Jesus' message later on. Or they might argue that the Quran isn't talking about the 12 disciples that we know. But here's the kicker. Surah 31:14 shuts this down. It reads, "O you who have believed, be supporters of Allah, as when Jesus the son of Mary said to the disciples, 'Who are my supporters for Allah?' The disciples said, 'We are the supporters of Allah.' And a faction of the children of Israel believed, and a faction disbelieved. So we supported those who believed against their enemy, and they became dominant." This shows that Jesus' apostles were victorious because Allah backed them, meaning that their message was legit. And Surah 355 backs us up even more. It says, "When Allah said, 'O Jesus, I am to take you in full and raise you towards myself, and to cleanse you of those who disbelieve, and to place those who follow you above those who disbelieve, up to the day of resurrection.'" So, any speculation about the apostles being wrong or deceived hits a brick wall because the Quran itself says Allah supported them and their message. So when we read Surah 352, it's crystal clear that it's talking about the disciples. Allah blessed these guys, bringing them to the top and validating their message. But you might be thinking, how do we know the apostles rejected core Islamic teachings? All right, let's get into it. Think about Paul the Apostle, every Muslim's favorite apostle. Sure, he wasn't one of the original 12, but he had a game-changing vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus as detailed in Acts chapter 9. Here's the thing. Paul was given the thumbs up by the original disciples of Jesus. This means his views on God and Christ were in sync with theirs. Even if we ignore the evidence that I'm about to drop, Surah 355 and Surah 61:14 make it clear. Paul's teachings must have matched those of the disciples. Why? Because the form of Christianity that blew up and took over the world is what Muslim polemicists call Pauline Christianity. And the Quran says it was Jesus' true followers who dominated and won. Now, let's talk about why Paul was on the same page as the original disciples. In Galatians 2:9, Paul mentioned how James, Peter, and John, major players among Jesus' disciples, recognized his mission and gave him their blessing. If Paul's teachings were way off, there's no way that they would have backed him. Paul's letters, which make up a big chunk of the New Testament, push beliefs that clash with Islamic teachings. He talks about the divinity of Christ, the crucifixion of Jesus, and the bodily resurrection, key Christian doctrines that Islam rejects. If the original disciples were pushing Islamic teachings, Paul's views would have been a deal breaker, but instead they endorsed him. Plus, the book of Acts shows Paul teaming up with the original disciples and being part of the early Christian crew. This shows there was strong agreement between Paul and the OG apostles. So, looking at how Paul was accepted by the original disciples and how his influence shaped early Christianity, it's obvious that the core Christian beliefs of Christianity, especially those that were spread by Paul, are miles apart from Islamic teachings. If the Quran is right about Allah backing the disciples and making them dominant, then the Christianity that spread, including Pauline theology, must have been the true message. This throws a major wrench into the Islamic narrative, showing that the real teachings of Jesus' followers were way different from what the Quran claimed. And even before Paul entered the scene, the book of Acts shows the disciples going all out in Jesus' name, preaching, baptizing, healing the sick, casting out demons, and declaring that salvation is found in no other name. They consistently preached that Jesus was crucified by Jewish leaders and raised from the dead. The historical account in Acts is rock solid, as I've explained in my other videos. Moreover, Peter, the top dog among the apostles, calls God Father and says Jesus was the sacrificial lamb slain before the foundation of the world and that he was raised from the dead, Peter and Paul's message dominated the scene, and you'll find similar claims in the non-Pauline epistles. This idea that the disciples were Muslims just doesn't hold water.